And so what Vattimo wants to get at with this idea that there has long been in philosophy, and philosophy basically inherited this role from religion, this idea, Plato, after all, as F. M. Cornford points out in his book From Religion to Philosophy, is simply taking the pantheon of the Olympic gods and turning them into the ideas. The Olympic gods simply become the forms in Plato. So he's basically inheriting the role of the priest, whose job, once again, is to have that privileged access to ultimate truth, upon which he can then advise the head of state, who can then back up that truth, usually with brutal military force. This has been the case all the way down to the Nazis, and it is the reason now that Vattimo says, with the rise of democratic societies and the victory of democracy over totalitarian thought systems, that this idea of ultimate truth, of what he calls foundational philosophy, essentialist philosophy is another way of putting it, has disintegrated. Truth no longer works in this way, in this correspondence way. But now, as somebody schooled in hermeneutics, it works in terms of Heidegger's theory of aletheia, in which he had said that truth is a process not of matching, it's a process of actually of making. The philosopher is creating truth in the process of articulating it, and doing so in accordance with a particular historical age's understanding of being and how it works in and for that age. And so that's basically the model that Vattimo is going to say that the role of the philosopher now should be, and it's a contingent model. And he says it's one that, whereas democracy is not compatible with these traditional authoritarian thought systems that are backed up by brute force, it is compatible with this later Heidegger, paradoxically, because Heidegger is normally, he's accused of being a fascist and supporting the Nazi order. But Vattimo says, no, Heidegger's idea of hermeneutics and aletheia is consistent with the democratic order, and its idea that we don't possess ultimate truth and cannot presume to back it up with military force and insist that everyone else act in accordance with this. It's a process. It has to be worked out through discussion and analysis. It has to be put to the test. It's something that is processual and is worked out. Now, what I would like to do, though, is to point out that Vattimo's idea about democracy is a little bit different from Alain Badiou's idea in ethics, in which he accuses democracy of precisely the opposite. Badiou says in ethics, his idea of a contingent ethics is similar to what Vattimo's saying, this emphasis on contingency, on taking particularities of particular historical situations into account, is similar to Badiou's idea in ethics of the idea that there is no universal ethics. There are just particular ethics that are based on contingent situations, each situation calling for its own ethic. That's similar to Vattimo's idea of now the philosopher as an ontologist of the actual, as he puts it, borrowing a term from Foucault. The philosopher is no longer an analysis of truth, an analyst of truth, but an ontologist of the actual. And so it's similar to Badiou in that sense, but yet Badiou, his whole basis of criticizing democracy in ethics, and particularly the American-backed by military force form of democracy, as it's filtered through the decisions of the UN and NATO and NAFTA and free trade agreements and so forth, is this idea that there is in fact actually an authoritarian order to this democracy backed up by American military force that the rest of the world is being forced to conform to, and that is pushed upon them by military force. It is authoritarian, and it is something that the rest of the world, there's this presupposition of a humanitarian order, and human rights violations justify humanitarian interventions. Syria right now will probably be the latest case of this need for a humanitarian intervention, but that these humanitarian interventions are called for on the part of the democratic world order because there has been a violation of human rights. And according to Badiou, there is an authoritarian nature to this. And so it's interesting that Badiou's theory of ethics very much is in collision with Vattimo's idea that the essence of democratic systems is precisely that they do not impose through military force these kinds of traditional ideas about a single doctrine of truth. Although sometimes he does admit that politicians do often lie and do often presuppose that there is only one order that they often make their decisions on. But he says ideally this should not be the case. Democracy should be something that is consistent with the Heideggerian aletheia, the idea of the philosopher not as an analyst of truth in the traditional sense, but the philosopher as an ontologist of the actual. And so he says in the essay that the ontology of the actual is a phrase which he has taken from Foucault, and which he says is the goal of the philosopher nowadays, and that it should be something that is now perfectly compatible with the democratic order, and that this runs completely counter to the traditional idea of the philosophies that are still claiming for themselves a foundational function with respect to politics, and that this type of philosopher should therefore be compatible with politics in this sense. So there's a real anxiety here on the part of Vattimo about the role of the philosopher. You can feel it here, similar to what I was saying earlier about the role of the artist, that there is an anxiety here that the philosopher is becoming completely superfluous with the disintegration and the crumbling of these metaphysical traditional thought systems that are grounded in what is thought to be absolute truth. The role of the philosopher is in trouble. And one might almost even say, I think, that the philosopher, along with the crumbling of these systems of metaphysical certainties, the role of the philosopher almost completely disappears, and he becomes something that no longer is even a philosopher. I think it's arguable that the type of philosopher that he's arguing for here is not even really a philosopher anymore. This is sort of, somebody who's an analyst or an advisor to heads of state. One would wonder what kind of a role that is, based on purely contingent circumstances, for a philosopher whose traditional idea is to be the guardian of universal truths, or the shepherd of being, as Heidegger would put it. So that's the first essay. That's the upshot of the first essay in Vattimo's Farewell to Truth. And Vattimo is a very good writer. He's very lucid. He reminds me in a certain sense of Zizek, except that he's not Slavoj Zizek, except that he's not quite as funny. And that is the first essay in this book, and I'll want to go ahead and look at the other two essays on the future of religion and the end of philosophy in the next couple of talks. So we'll leave it there, I think, with this idea of politics without truth that he advances in this first part of this wonderful little book.